And he mentioned this hadith with this isnad. He said, this isnad is acceptable. Yes, it's incomplete, but you know, many good hadith are not completely linked. Muttasal, musnad. And there's nothing objectionable about it. Yes, it's a Basra and Qadari riwayah, but so what? These people were good Muslims, and we don't deny that they had some good teachings. So he accepted this hadith as sound, although he admitted it wasn't, sahih, it was hasan. So there were some Sunni authorities who found there's nothing wrong with this hadith. The second version now, look at number 2. This comes from a Shiite book. Al-Barqi Mahasin. I don't want to get into details. It was picked up by his 2 generations later by Kulaini, one of the major acceptable or canonical collections of the Ithna Ashari 12 or Imami community. Look at the isnad. Al-Hasan ibn Mahbub, Al-Ala ibn Razin. He was a slave dealer in boys and girls from Madain. He moved between Iraq and Medina. Muhammad ibn Muslim, famous disciple of Muhammad al-Baqir, the 5th Imam of the Shia. Abu Ja'far, Muhammad ibn Baqir. This is the form that Baqir gives. لَمَّا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ الْعَقْلِ. When God created the intelligence, istantaqahu. He interrogated him. He tested him. A new feature appears here. But actually it illuminates the context of the other version too. Then he said to him, Aqbil, come forward. So he drew near. Then he said to him, Adbir, go back. So he withdrew. Then he said to him, Bi'izzati wa jalali, I did not create any creature dearer to me than thee. I do not make you perfect, wala akmuluka, except in one whom I love, illa fi man ahabba. Thee alone I command, and thee alone I forbid. Thee alone I reward, and thee alone I punish. Here it's much more clearer the consequences of the obedience of aql. God commands and forbids aql. God rewards and punishes aql. This really seems to be confirming the reality of the theological context of human deeds for this hadith. And furthermore, the idea of istantaqahu. God is examining or testing. What's happening here when God says to the aql, he says, Aqbil. So the Prophet, Aqbil comes forward. He says, Adbir. So he turns around and he goes back. He's facing forward and facing back. Or another way would be, Aqbil wa Adbir would be, let me see the front of you, now turn around and let me see the back of you. So aql is displaying all of himself to God. So God then says, Bi'izzati wa jalali, I never created anything so good as you. He had seen all sides of aql, and he saw that aql was perfectly comprehending and obeying every instruction that God gave him. So he praised aql. So that aql would be, in this sense, the religious aql which understands God's revelation and God's commands, and which responds accordingly, and which thereby deserves to be rewarded. Now, there's a lot more we can say. There's about 30 versions of this hadith with riwayat, isnads. They're found mainly in Sunni sources. This is not a Shiite hadith, although it was also known to the Shiites because it was common teaching of all the Muslims. And the fact that it was taught by Hasan al-Basri in Basra in the late 1st century and al-Baqir in Medina in the late 1st century probably points to its prior existence by the middle or early 1st century. Well, that's pretty early. And in terms of proving the authenticity of a hadith by the most critical standards, it's hard to go further than that. Anyway, let's look at number 3. This is a more expanded version. We saw number 2 is Muhammad al-Baqir, his son Ja'far al-Sadiq, so-called 6th Imam of the Ithna Ashari, 5th Imam of the Ismailis. This version, which you'll see the text briefly excerpted on the following page, is much more elaborate. It's a whole different context. Ja'far has taken the primitive teaching of his father and of the Basran Qadaris and of the Syrian Qadaris and the Egyptian. I didn't mention all the different versions and how widespread they were and how well attested they are. It's not prophetic, but it's certainly the era of the companions in a number of major centers. Here we have a cosmic setting. I will read the opening part and then describe the context of the rest of the hadith. It's very long. It's what Professor Awani was referring to, the 75 troops or soldiers. Yeah? إِنَّ اللَّهَ خَلَقَ الْعَقْلَ وَهُوَ أَوَّلُ خَلْقٍ خَلَقَهُ مِنَ الرُّوحَانِيِّينَ عَنْ يَمِينَ الْأَرْشِ مِنْ نُورِهِ ثُمَّ قَالَ لَهُ أَقْبِلْ فَأَقْبَلَ ثُمَّ قَالَ لَهُ أَدْبِرْ فَأَدْبَرَ. Right? Then, after this creation of the intelligence and the testing of it, ثُمَّ خَلَقَ الْجَحَلِ مِنَ الْبَحْرِ الْعُجَاجِ ظُلْمَانِيًّا. Very powerful image from the salty, briny ocean. The opposite of this, the light of the throne, right? So God created this principle of human intelligence, and it is the first creature, أول خلق, that He created among الروحانيون. How do we understand this? Ruhaniyun, spiritual beings, immaterial beings. In my opinion, we have to go outside of Islam and look at, for example, Syriac Christianity. Ruhanaye, the angelic hosts, the angels who bear the throne. It seems to be there's a parallel there. He's talking about an angelic host. Now, this is still not the very first creation, but this is the first among the immaterial beings. Right? And they are what? On the right side of the throne from His light. Here we have a throne realm, God's throne. Well, God's throne takes us back to even a pre-creation, pre-world creation. It's a very early moment in existence. You were in a completely different realm. Putting aql as a cosmic principle or a spiritual principle close to God's throne. It's a very interesting development. It shows something about the man who developed this version, that he was a religious genius. And when we read more, we'll see. So in the testing of aql, face forward, face back. Then he praises it. Then he creates against aql another principle called jahal, ignorance, folly. Now, he created that from the water, the salty water of the dark ocean. When he commands jahal, jahal does the opposite. He says to jahal, face back, and he goes back. Then he commands to jahal, come forward, but he does not come forward. So jahal does the opposite. Jahal faces away, but does not turn back towards God. You see? Yeah, these two principles. Then God curses him, and he says, have you become full of pride? And he curses him. Then he equips aql with 75 troops, we saw. Good, truth, sincerity, virtue, honesty, all 75 good virtues that you can think of are there, right? And the study of them is very important. Each one is complemented by its opposite, which belongs to the powers of jahal, okay? Then but first he gives to aql 75 troops. At that point, jahal complains in this hadith. He said, you are giving him 75 against me. I have nothing. It's not fair, God. So God said, okay, I will give you also against him 75. So that it will be a fight between you. You are equal. So you can't complain to me that I imposed on you unfairness. What is going on? Let's go to Quran al-Sad. God says to Iblis when he commands the angels to bow to Adam, Istakbarta am kunta min al-alina? He says to Iblis, have you become proud? Do you think you are one of the high ones? The high ones, who are they? Al-alina, the angels, the highest hosts. And then Iblis refuses to bow to Adam. And after God curses Iblis, Iblis intercedes with God. Remember the verse, the context? On the disobedience of Iblis at the creation of Adam. God casts Iblis out of heaven, curses him till judgment day. إِلَى يَوْمَ الْوَقْتِ الْمَعْلُومِ. And Iblis requests a respite from God. He says, God grants him a delay. مِنَ الْمُنذَرِينَ. So Iblis presses his advantage. Now that God gave him a small concession, he says, okay, I'll wait until the day when you are awaited. Until then you have a certain amount of activity and power and force. I am not completely disempowering you. So Iblis takes advantage from this respite by declaring, by means of God's might, he shall lead astray sons of Adam. فَبِعِزَّتِكَ لِأَغْوِيَنَّهُمْ أَجْمَعِينَ. He says, بِعِزَّتِكَ, by your power I will lead them astray. In other words, God is telling, Iblis is leading humans astray by my will and my permission. He's not against me. He is doing what I want him to do. This is very important. Iblis is not the enemy of God. Iblis is the enemy of Adam. Iblis has a special role to play in creation that God intended. As the Mu'tazilites later would say, if God did not wish to be disobeyed, he would not have created Iblis. But the fact he did create Iblis makes one think that he wants to be disobeyed, or allows for the possibility of disobedience. It's a deep theological issue. We won't get into it here. So, the point is that in this hadith, Ja'far al-Sadiq is making an allusion. Aql, Adam. Jahal, Iblis. He's bringing the context of the conflict between ignorance and intelligence within the soul of the person into the context of the Quranic Adam and Iblis. And he's making a link with it to a cosmic dimension of throne and light and darkness. I don't want to go into too many details, but if you study completely the context, and you look especially at the Isnad, where you see that several of the people involved in the Isnad were from Mada'in, which was a center of Manichaean activity in the middle of the 2nd century. I would say Ja'far is combating Manichaean dualism in this hadith. He's accepting a certain amount of dualism into a monotheistic scheme, but providing a kind of intellectually satisfying solution to what the dualist idea, the evil God is responsible for all evil, not the good God. But in this scheme, you cannot say that the good God, or the only God, is somehow unconnected to the existence of Iblis and his evil troops. God has a role. God gave Iblis 75 troops, and they're all evil forces. So here we have a monotheistic scheme with an enclosed dualism. It's a psychological dualism, of course. Similar in many ways to the dualism of the Essenes in the Dead Sea. So we can't go into too much detail here. But there is one more hadith which is not on the screen or in your handouts, which I want to mention. It has to do with the idea of the throne. And here we go back to the book by Dawood ibn al-Muhabbar in his Kitab al-Aql, which was so much despised and hated by the Sunni hadith critics. Even one of them lamented, if only he had not written that book, they said, because it was so influential and it had so many interesting ideas in it. Here's a lengthy narrative from that book, which was quoted first in partial by Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi, a famous early Sufi, in his book Nawadir al-Usul, 3rd century, and picked up, also cited by Ghazali, Nahi al-Lumudin, and a number of other sources. In fact, the complete text is found in later compilations of fake hadith books. The professional critics made compilations of mawdu'at. They say, these are the bad hadith. Don't believe them. They're all bad. They're no good. So at least we have the text. We thank them for their efforts. And this book, this hadith is a frame story is obviously contrived. A certain companion of the Prophet named Abdullah ibn Salam, who was a Jewish rabbi who converted to Islam. Actually, he died in the year 43. He lived, and he was a historical person. He's portrayed as questioning the Prophet Muhammad about the throne and arsh. He said the throne is supposed to be the greatest of all of the creation of God. And the Prophet says to him, actually Ibn Salam, he says, the angels asked God the same question once about which is the greatest creation of all, thinking it was the throne, and God informed them that it's not the throne, but al-aql, and that aql is beyond the comprehension even of the angels. So then God tells the angels, according to this hadith, which is reported by the Prophet to Ibn Salam, and recorded in Dawood's book, he says about aql, knowledge of it cannot be fully comprehended. Do you have knowledge of the number of grains of sand? Truly I created aql as diverse sorts, like unto the number of grains of sand. That's a trope, a literary figure for unlimited. Right? Of that I give some people a single grain, habba, and to some 2 or 3 grains, and to some I give an entire sack, mud, and to some I give a whole camel's load, wasaq, and to some 2 loads, and to some even more. Meaning he distributes aql unequally. To some he gives a little bit, to some he gives a lot. So Ibn Salam asked the Prophet, who is the fortunate one who is receiving such huge measures of innate intelligence and understanding? The Prophet says, those who labor in accordance with obedience to God are given measures of aql in proportion to their deeds and their diligence and their certainty. عَلَى قَدْرِ أَعْمَالِهِمْ وَجِدِّهِمْ وَيَقِينِهِمْ. And in proportion to the light that God placed in their hearts. Their custodian, qayyim in all of this, is al-aql, which God provided them. Thus, in proportion to that finite measure of intelligence granted them by God, the worker among them, al-amil, the laborer among them, labors and rises in degrees. يَرْتَفَعُ بِدَرَجَاتٍ. Actually, we have here the basic outline of a mystical system. This is what Sufism developed out of. They always trace it back to Hassan al-Basri. The great Sufi in Baghdad a century later, Al-Muhasibi quotes these hadith. He knows he's part of this tradition. Junaid. Muhasibi taught Junaid. Right? He said the Sufi, through his understanding, works and performs deeds of obedience and labors, and through the efforts he makes, he receives greater and deeper insight, and he will go up in degree, meaning in comprehension. At the basis of this teaching, which was expanded by Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi, who quotes this very hadith, a century and a half later, and developed the notion of the awliya, the saints, who are the most highly endowed with aql and closest to God. Right? Dr. Pazuki mentioned about the awliya and their being exemplifying the highest degree of spiritual intelligence. He was referring to this is the origin of this idea. Nevertheless, we don't have time to go into detail here. When we come back, we'll continue with some more of these hadith, and then I want to move to the later period with Al-Ghazali and some of the later developments based on this hadith, the creation hadith, how it unfolded and assumed various meanings in different systems of thought and practice over many centuries, right down to the 20th century. Okay, inshallah. Thank you for listening. It's like backtracking a little bit. We get a parallel series of riwayat, very famous, and these are in Bukhari and Muslim. Ibn Abbas narratives on Al-Qalam. This is very famous. أول ما خلق الله القلم فقال له. First that God created is the pen. Thereupon he said to it, write. So it wrote what came to pass and what will come to pass. You know, ما كان وما هو كائن until resurrection day. This is a predeterminist hadith. Everything has been written, predetermined. Maktub, we say in Arabic. Huh? Everything maktub. I can't change it. God already wrote the pen and finished. Cannot be undone. This is the opposite of the aql teaching. I am born a sinner or a saved person. God put the Umayyads into power and we obey them. It's already been decided. Nothing I can do about it. Right? This is much more of a flat kind of theology, which was also known in the early century